would want. And he's coming from Qatar National University. Very pleased to have him here.
Yes, yes. All right, so before I said that my position was going to be almost opposite of Doug, but in fact it may be pretty much the same, except that we're sort of approaching it from a different angle. But to clarify the project, which is related to one of the questions that Doug got, for sure, we're, seems like the only reason to ask about the compatibility of different theories of causation with occasionalism is to see how far we can make occasionalism a sort of coherent theory, one which is coherent with a philosophy of nature, which is also plausible, right? And the only reason to be an occasionalist is a theological reason. So the occasionalist says simply that God is the only cause of everything and nothing else causes anything. So throughout this presentation, I'm just going to go with that very simple formulation of occasionalism, and then I'm going to compare that with the analyses of causation that the different theories give. Of course, if God doesn't exist, then occasionalism is false, and there's no reason to have such a project, right? If he does exist, it's possible that occasionalism is true, but it doesn't necessarily follow. There are challenges, right? And the reason for the motivation for that is, of course, is to try to clarify this issue about the divine action, or in general the relation between God and creation and nature, right? To make sense of how God could act in the world and in what way that happens. So the list of theories, roughly similar to what Doug presented. There's a few missing here, and I have regularity theory, but I think some of the ones that he spoke about basically are versions of regularity theory. The first one I want to talk about is regularity theory, because it's kind of like the granddaddy of the modern and contemporary theories of causation, even though it's not necessarily in favor now, but others like counterfactual theory of causation, for example, are sort of modifications on a theme, which is reductionism about causation, inspired by Humean considerations. So the regularity theory basically tells us that C causes E if and only if C is spatiotemporally contiguous to E. E succeeds C in time, and all events of type C are regularly followed by or constantly conjoined with uniformly related events of type E. We should pause for a moment there, because that's not necessarily Hume's theory, even though that comes out of Hume's text. In Hume, there's some ambiguity, it seems to me, as to whether he's analyzing causation or giving an explanation, a psychological explanation, of why we postulate causation in nature when we have no philosophical justification to do so. Right? So that sort of theory of a psychological association or habit that he gives is a little bit different. The difference between the two, I think, can be summed up in the question as to whether or not it's realist or not about causation. So if we go with a kind of a subjective theory of association, then we're really saying that causation is not real. But if we take a straightforward reductive analysis of causation, and the way regularity theory is formulated here, we're not anti-realist about causation. We are reducing causation to non-causal properties and relations, but as long as those non-causal properties and relations to which we are reducing causation are real, then technically speaking we are being realist about causation. We're saying that causation does happen in nature, and not just in our own interpretation of nature or our own habit of association things together. It's not merely a subjective thing, but it is not irreducible. It's reducible to non-causal properties and relations. And in this case, that's what's happening, right? And for that reason, precisely, regularity theory, I think, is completely incompatible with occasionalism, because if regularity theory is true, it's clear to see that God can cause nothing, right?
No, but this is only true if it is deterministic. If events you are talking about are deterministic.
No. Even if the events are not deterministic.
If it is not deterministic, then somebody has to determine it. Somebody has to, a supernatural agency or something, has to take care of choosing between the probabilities.
Well, it's
Not so.
if God is causing the things, right, then the regularity theory is false. Because God's not a spatio-temporal event, right? And when we say that God causes everything, we're not saying that God's will that the thing be simply precedes the event in time. So what's going on here is, again, you're thinking of this in terms of a philosophy of nature, and I'm talking about this theory as an analysis of causation. You understand what I'm saying? You're correct if you want to use regulatory theory or interpret it as a philosophy of nature, then for sure it's compatible with the idea that God is placing or creating the events in the times and places in which they occur. But that's not a theory of causation. God's creating those events, He's causing them, and His causing them is not simply a matter of His will being in a certain spatio-temporal relation with those events.
Whichever theory you are applying, unless you presume or pre-assume the deterministic structure for events, cause and effect, then you still will need God to sustain the world, to operate the law. As we shouldn't forget the other two lectures which we have listened, lecture of Professor Luke, and where he told us about the views of Descartes, Leibniz, and there is always the sustainment of the law. Sustainment, or between two brackets, conservation of motion, etc. Who will do it?
Yeah, well, I'm sympathetic to you. I actually agree with you. What you're saying here is that regularity theory is implausible, and I agree. My point here is that regularity theory is incompatible with occasionalism. So I think we really actually agree on that. So, this may make it clear. Instead of considering regularity theory as a theory of causation, which is what it is, yeah, we can consider it as a theory of quasi-causation. That's to say, what if we take the theory not as a theory of what causation is, but merely an account of what kind of empirical, observable, spatio-temporal relations between events lead us to falsely attribute causal relations between them, right? And then we have something which could possibly be compatible with occasionalism, because we are then saying that nothing in nature really causes anything else, but they are just spatio-temporally arranged in such a way that leads us to believe that they cause something else. But this is not the regularity theory. The regularity theory, as our colleague back here noted in the last discussion, simply says what it is to cause something is just to be placed in this kind of spatio-temporal pattern. Right? And of course, the occasionalist cannot take that as an analysis of causation, because it would make occasionalism, it's just incompatible with occasionalism. It's incompatible with theological commitments that any occasionalist would probably hold to, right? God is not a spatio-temporal event. He doesn't have spatio-temporal relations with things. And when we say that He causes them, we're not simply saying that He is there before them in a sort of regular pattern. So that we have here, if you see all events of type C are regularly followed by events of type E. Well, we'll have to say then that there's lots of gods, and there's a god behind every event, and each god is a token of a type. Well, that's that's not going to work, right? Theologically, there's no sense in that, right? There is the occasionalist, I think, wants to say that there's one God that creates everything in the pattern in which it exists. Not that there's, a separate God behind each event, and that each God is, like the other ones. Okay, never mind. You get the idea, right? Okay, so if we take regular theory as a theory of quasi-causation, rather than a theory of causation, then, the occasionalist is all right, possibly, because we have the idea of causation. We know there is causation, and God causes everything. But then we have this other thing, which is not causation, but for some reason we tend to think it is, right? And that is this regularity that we see in nature, that leads us to believe that some things in nature cause other things. But if we do that, right, we need to follow that up with an account an account of why it is that these spatio-temporal relations lead us to match certain things in nature as causes to other things in nature as effects, even though they're not. And that seems to be something which an occasionalist will not want to ignore, right? Because nobody will think occasionalism is plausible unless we can explain, well, if nothing in nature really causes anything, why does everybody naturally and so intuitively think it does, right? So we will have to not just have our regularity theory or our theory of quasi-causation, but we also need a concept of causation, which, right, we have to have an idea of what causation actually is, right? And then explain why a certain kind of spatio-temporal pattern leads us to postulate causation, yeah? In terms of some relation between that spatio-temporal pattern and what causation really is that makes us mistaken. You see what I'm saying? And so I think that what the occasionalist really needs is a theory of quasi-causation, not a theory of, well, he needs both really, but he needs a theory of causation in order to get a theory of quasi-causation off the ground, right? So these are just, the reason I'm bringing up in regularity theory is simply to kind of drive a lesson learned about what we really need to be doing here and what the challenges for occasionalism actually are. And there are the three lessons, right? Lesson one, the occasionalist is committed to affirming our possession of a concept of causation, in terms of which it is meaningfully true to say that God is the only cause of everything, right? Because if we actually do believe that God is the cause of everything and nothing else causes anything else, then we have to have a conception of causation which is compatible with that view, right? I mean, we have to actually have a concept of it, right? Because if we don't have any concept of it, then we're actually saying something that we don't know what it means. And that won't be very good either, right? Secondly, this concept should also be such as to facilitate a plausible explanation of why we commonly, but mistakenly, find it intuitive to think that things are caused by other than God, yeah? So if I do that, people naturally, right, and intuitively think the noise was caused by his hitting the table, yeah? So, whereas occasionalists asking people to believe, wait a minute, that's not really true, that doesn't really, your hitting the table wasn't the cause, God was the cause, right? And now I think an explanation from our side is in order, don't you think? So, and it won't, and that explanation won't be, well, because causation just is a sort of, spatio-temporal succession. Because we're not saying that God spatio-temporally succeeds things or precedes things when we say that he's the cause of everything, right? So we can't say that that's what causation is. We can say that that's how nature works, and that's a philosophy of nature, but that's not an analysis of causation. We need to keep these things separate. So the third thing is actually derivative of these. When we consider contemporary accounts of causality, we need to be precise about what it exactly is, either that account is intended to do, or what we are taking the account to be doing. Yeah. Okay, so we can move on to counterfactual theory, and we'll look at it in the same in light, right? Counterfactual theory, as Doug pointed out earlier, just simply put, C causes E if and only if. Had C not occurred, then E would not have occurred. And this is what we call counterfactual dependence. Right? E counterfactually depends on C. So now, from occasionalism, it's true, right, that for any event E, if God had not willed E, then E would not have occurred, right? So for any C and for any event E, if C is not God's will to E, then it is not true that had C not occurred, then E would not have occurred. Okay? So far, so good, right? If God didn't will it, it wouldn't happen. Yeah? Okay. But not so fast. The occasionalist should accept that if God had not willed D, he would not have willed E, for example. Why? Well, because one of the objections that is brought against occasionalism in the history of occasionalism, particularly you find it with Ibn Rushd criticizing Al-Ghazali, right? And it is that if occasionalism is true, then the universe is basically havoc. You're saying that there's no order in the universe. And if you say there's no order in the universe, you're taking away one of the main signs of the existence of God in nature, right? That the perfection and harmony of order in the world is one of the evidences that there's an intelligent creator, Okay? So, but the answer to that, of course, is that that's not really true, right? God is arranging events in an orderly way, yeah? So the idea that there's no causal relations between natural or created events themselves doesn't entail that there's no order in the universe. We're just saying, right, that the order is sustained by God, right, in every event. So, for that reason, sure, we should say, I think we should accept counterfactuals of that sort. If God had not willed E, he would not have willed D, he would not have willed E. Which is just to say that to maintain the optimal perfection of the order of the universe, we want to say that this is the best of all possible worlds, that it couldn't be better than it is, right? Everything that happens, happens because that's what's needed in order to sustain the perfection and harmony of the order, which is the sign that God exists and is the creator. Then we would want to say, yes, if God had not willed certain things, he would not have willed other things, right? But we don't want to say that God could not have willed, right? It's would not, could not have, yeah? So I would imagine it's from the peripatetic Aristotelian perspective here. We want to say, no, we have to say that if God had not willed D, he could not have willed D. We won't say that. He keeps the perfection of the order as a matter of his mercy and his will, not as a matter of necessity, something following from his nature, right? And God acts by will and not by necessity, according to the classical occasionalist view. So I'm bringing in also some theological commitments here that I think are really essential in order for there to be any motivation for occasionalism. But it follows from that, right, that if D had not occurred, God would not have willed E. Yeah? And so that, for that reason, counterfactual analysis of causation is not compatible with occasionalism. Because we also would agree, right, as occasionalists, that if D had not occurred, God would not have willed E. But we will not agree that D is the cause of E, right? So we have now a mismatch between the analysis and what we can accept as what causation is. Okay? So counterfactual dependence may be a useful analytic tool, right? For example, in talking about the the excellence of the order in the universe, right? But it wouldn't be good for an account of causation, at least for an occasionalist. Okay. So I'm going to talk about probability theory now, and one of the things that motivates probability theories is the problem of the direction of causality. Because on regularity theory and on counterfactual theory, there's kind of a classic problem of accounting for what makes the difference between the cause and the effect. So causation has an essential or intrinsic direction from the cause to the effect. But these sort of reductionist theories, like regularity theory and counterfactual theory, sometimes have the problem of, what is it that makes the cause different from the effect? They're both sort of, related to each other in this symmetrical way. So sometimes people would want to account for the direction of causality in terms of the direction of time. And it's straightforward in the regularity theory, right? We saw that the cause, in order to be the cause of E, C has to precede E in time, right? But we would not want to reduce the direction of causation to the direction of time, again, because we probably don't want to say that God has essentially a temporal relation to events in time, right? These timers. So we don't want to say that what makes God the cause of some event and the event at the effect is simply the fact that God willed the event before it happened, right? That's not going to go. So the probability theory wants to account for the direction of causality independently of the direction of time, right? So they do that in this way. We take three events, A, B, and C, where A and B are probabilistically independent, conditional on C. Then C is the common cause of A and B, if and only if the probability of A given C is greater than the probability of A given not C, and the probability of B given C is greater than the probability of B given not C. Yeah. Okay, so let's think about that. Right? If occasionalism is true, then it would follow, let's say that Cx means, right, God wills X. So under occasionalism, for all events X, it will be true that the probability of X given that God wills X is 1, right? 100%, right? And the probability of x given that God doesn't will x is 0. Yeah? So from that it follows that for all x the probability, yeah, okay, so there we go. No, wait a minute, let's see. I lost myself, excuse me. Yes, for all x the probability of the event given that God wills it is greater than the probability of the event given that God doesn't will it, yeah? Because 1 is more than 0. But suppose that God wills for 3 events A, B, and D, that the probability of A given D is greater than the probability of A given not D, and that the probability of B given D is greater than the probability of B given not D. In that case, if God wills it, it will obtain, right? But D is still not going to be the cause of A or B, because we're saying only God is the cause, right? So probability theory as an analysis of causation, not compatible with occasionalism. So we can go to the process theory. Again, as Doug pointed out, the process theory, well, basically, let's 3 points to make it simple. A process is anything with constancy of structure over time. Yeah? A causal process, though, is distinct from other non-causal processes. And that a causal process possesses a conserved quantity of something, right? Energy, momentum, anything which the physics theories like to talk about. So, then a causal interaction is a transfer of such a conserved quantity between processes. Yeah. So let's think about that. And we have a problem here. If in any causal interaction, each process is the cause of a change in the other, since a transfer of the conserved quantity affects both by decreasing the quantity possessed by one and increasing that of the other. But as occasionalists, we say that God is the only cause and thus cannot be affected by anything else, right? If he could be affected by anything else, then something other than God would be a cause, okay? So whatever quantity, if we want to think about it that way, whatever quantity that he might be understood as transferring to some process, maybe we could say some existence or something, I don't know, yeah? The giving cannot decrease him in any way, yeah? Of course, if the giving of that quantity did decrease him in some way, then something else would be the cause because he would be affected, right? So whatever quantity might be understood as transferring to some process is not a conserved quantity. And then it follows that the causal interaction is not a transfer of conserved quantity between processes. If it's the case that we're going to maintain that God is the cause and nothing else is. Okay? Okay, but there's a lesson that we can learn from the process theory of causation, I think, as occasionalists, with regard to our obligatory task of explaining quasi-causation, as I talked about before. One of the problems that process theories of causation faces is the problem of causation by omission. So, for example, this is when the lack or absence of something is taken to be a cause. We say the plant caused or died for a lack of water, right? Well, it seems like the cause of the plant's dying then is not any conserved quantity, it's the absence of something, right? So if a causal interaction is always the transfer of a conserved quantity, then this can't really be a case of causation, right? Or else process theory is wrong. So of course, instead of saying that process theory is wrong, the process theorists will try to explain that, well, actually this is not a genuine case of causation by omission, and we'll explain it in some other way, right? This is a quasi-causation, and they explain this in terms of counterfactual theory, right? If the plant had water, it would not have died, something like that. And this is how we think of it, but it's not a real case of causation. It's quasi-causation. It's one of those cases where we talk about causation being there, even though it's not really there, right? So we could learn from the process theory in terms, at least in terms of how they respond to some projections. And I think that this concept of quasi-causation is something occasionalists should explore. And they account for quasi-causation, like I said, by in one case, for example, a case of counterfactual conditional But they also talk about this similarity of epistemic roles, right? Why do we call these cases of quasi-causation as causation? Well, it's because they play similar epistemic role that actual cases of causation do. So I haven't developed any idea on really this idea much, and I'm not sure if it's very promising, but it seems possible that we could say the cases of quasi-causation that we take to be quasi-occasionalists, which is quite a bit more than what the process theory people have to do, right? We have to say that every single natural event that we normally take as a cause is not really a cause. So how could this be? Well, maybe it has something to do with an epistemic role that a property or a complex of non-causal properties and relations in nature play that may be similar to what the concept of actual causation in there would play if it were there. We can explore that some. I think that's a good assignment for future research. Okay, so we go now to the powers and dispositionalist theories of causation. Yeah. Now maybe I'll have to read some from my paper because I'm not really good at talking. When I panic, I'll need something to read. But I'll try not to read until it's necessary, if it's necessary. So, the powers theories say that causation is the manifestation of a power. Right? Now, definitely, the philosophy of nature, which motivates the typical powers theorist, is completely incompatible with occasionalism. Right? Because the powers theorists basically wanted to oppose the Humean philosophy of nature. Yeah? Now, the Humean philosophy of nature is compatible with occasionalism, no problem, but the Humean analysis of causality is totally problematic for occasionalism, right? Now, it's interesting because we have something here the reverse. The philosophy of nature that motivates the powers theory is totally incompatible with occasionalism. It's exactly what we want to deny, right? But I think that their analysis of causation is a lot more amenable for occasionalists. So, what are we saying? That they say that causation is the manifestation of a power. Things in nature have powers. What does that mean? A power is, for them, a real universal. It's not reducible to categorical properties, right? Say, I have the power to raise my arm. I'm not doing it. It's not something that's actually there, perceivable, but it's sort of a latent capability. And the thing is, the idea of a power to raise my arm is something which my arm has, or I have, let's say, and it's related to this event, my raising of my arm, which isn't really taking place, right? It's the power to do it, yeah? So if it's a Jungian worldview, I raise my arm or I don't raise my arm, right? But here it's, no, you have the power. Basically, if you're, from people who are interested in the medieval philosophy and the Islamic context of talking about occasionalism, really it's pretty much true. And at least it's helpful to think of the dispositional theory and the powers theory as a kind of a neo-Aristotelianism, because really what they're trying to do is resurrect, the kind of a maybe modified contemporary version of an Aristotelian theory here, a paradigm, where we have, potencies and powers, right, and this kind of thing. So, the power is universal. It's not reducible to categorical properties. It's something that Hume would spit at. Power has its instantiations in individual existence. I have the power to raise my arm, that's universal, but I raise my arm, that's one particular instance. Okay? Such instantiations are actually the manifestations of the power. Yeah? A power is distinct from its manifestations. Another thing which Jungians would definitely deny, right? They would say, well, all you mean by that you have the power to raise your arm is that you've done so in the past. And maybe you have this expectation that you could do in the future, right? But no, we have something different. Power is distinct from its manifestations, not reducible to these manifestations or any kind of pattern of manifestations. The power is held even if and when it is not manifest. I have the power to raise my arm even when I'm not raising it. Yeah, I can't reduce the power to do it to just if it's happening. Therefore, I can have the power to do something that I actually never do, right? And yet I have the power to do it. So, if or when it is not manifest, its manifestations remain real possibilities, so long as the power is held. And all events on this theory are effects of the manifestation of a power. Everything happens for a cause, something else which had the power to bring it about, right? And its coming about is the actualization of that potency, to use Aristotle's language, but these guys might probably be called Aristotelians, so they'll use different terms to escape. But that's what it is, right? All events on this theory are effects of the manifestation of a power. So to me, this is perfectly consistent with occasionalism, on the condition that only God has power, right? So we only differ from them with regard to our philosophy of nature, but wow, man, their analysis of causation is perfect for us, right? Not only that, they face certain problems that occasionalists can actually help them solve, right? So for example, how do we individuate manifestations and powers, right? So we have this problem that I would sort of sum it up as the individuation of and relation between manifestations of power and powers. Yeah? So for example, fragility is one disposition which is often used as a classic example. We say a glass is fragile, it has the power to break. Even when it's not breaking, it's still fragile, right? So we have fragility, which is something that the glass has, and we have breaking. Now there's all kind of ways the glass could break, right? If I throw it down really hard, it might break into tiny little fragments, or if I just hit it, in one place, it could break in two. I mean, how many different ways could a glass break? A plethora of different ways, right? And these seem to be legitimately, specifically different breakings, not the same breaking, right? So they are different manifestations. Each one would be a different manifestation. Yeah? Things don't break in the same way. Yeah? So that means we have to ask, well, does that mean that there are just as many different powers, or is just one fragility? Yeah. So there's a kind of a difficulty that they face there. Another difficulty is, well, I guess I'm sorry, I forgot to put the solution. Well, our solution is obvious, right? God is one, and everything else is a manifestation of His power, and His power is simple, the power to make be. Yeah? Right? You don't have to have fragility and, elasticity or different specific types of, potentials. God has the power to make exist out of nothing, right? And every manifestation of that power can be as specifically different as every other and related to this one single power to make be. That seems like a pretty clean and easy solution for that. And then the other problem they face, which is this is more interesting actually, is this fact that the powers theorists have to postulate that there's a necessary relation, a de re necessary relation, between the power and its manifestation, even when it's not manifest, right? I actually have the power to raise my arm, right? And what that means is that I have this sort of disposition or this power, between which there's a necessary relation to that, right? Like I can do it, and this thing that I'm not doing, right? And that relation has to exist between my power and this thing which I'm not actually doing. So we have this weird idea, it seems like a necessary relation between a power and a non-existent thing, a non-existent manifestation. So that's kind of a problem for powers theorists, right? And one of the proposed solutions for powers theorists is to say, let's think of the manifestation of a power in the way we would think of an intentional object, right? So I want to raise my arm, and see the object of my desire is to raise my arm, but I'm not raising my arm. So we can understand an intentional object as sort of existing as an object of my desire, but not something realized in action. And so I can pretty clearly understand, I guess, the relation between my desire to raise my arm and this intentional object, right? Something I'm thinking about, right? But that's going to be a problem for the powers theorists because they have to turn into panpsychists, right? They'd have to say that every natural event is sort of an intentional object, right? An object of some intention. And so every cause in nature is kind of a will, right? So we have an interesting Nietzschean kind of worldview or something like that. So that's not really something that they want because they want to be really natural and everything, as power theorists. And that's a kind of a crazy idea. But for us, well, we're already occasionalists, so how much more crazy can we get, right? Everything is an intentional object, naturally. Yeah, everything is the will of God, right? And that's what we're saying. Yeah, so that really means that every event is an intentional object. So there should not be any problem to conceive the relation between God's will and events in the world as the relation between, as a relation to intentional objects, so that that relation can be there even if that thing never comes about. We should say, I'm sorry, I should back up. It wouldn't be a relation between God's will, it would be a relation between His power. To get theological, we have to distinguish. I'm not going to, I think Nazif will help me here from making mistakes there. But if we say that there's a relation between His will and something, we'll have to say that that thing does come about, right? If we say that there's a relation between His power and something, we can say that thing can come about, right? He has the power to do it. Whether He does, it depends on whether there's also a relation between His will and that. So, of all actual events, many people say, are manifestations of God's will. Any possible event, I suppose, is an object of God's power. Whether it actually happens is also depends on whether it's an object of His will or not. And I have to work on that to make it more. But this is, I think, a good reason for occasionalists to consider the power's analysis of causation as something useful. The last one I want to talk about, I probably have to read here because I didn't finish the slides. But the agency theory. So, I'll just read from here if that's all right. For agency theories, the basic analysis of causation is that an event A is a cause of a distinct event B, just in case bringing about the occurrence of A is an effective means by which a free agent could bring about the occurrence of B. In occasionalism, God's willing that B is the only effective means by which a free event could bring about B. On occasionalism, God's willing that B is the only effective means by which a free agent could bring about B, entailing that the free agent is in every case God. Okay? And if B whole obtains, then God's will that B is the cause of B. Strictly speaking, then, the biconditional holds. If A is a cause of B, then A is an effective means by which a free agent could bring about B, and vice versa. So the basic conceptual analysis of causation here is compatible with occasionalism. Of course, the wider aim of agency theories, as the agency theorists have advanced them, is to apply this concept to nature, where A is a natural event, and that's not going to be compatible with occasionalism. Nor would the occasionalist probably want to understand God's willing that B as an event, properly speaking. Also, this underscores the fact that the occasionalist has either to deny human freedom or else make sense of affirming human freedom while denying human causal agency. But that is a separate problem that I think other people have talked about. The rest of the agency interventionist theory has to be rejected, however, since aside from the conceptual analysis of causation in terms of agency, it is essentially a probabilistic account of causality as a relation between things that, according to occasionalism, are not agents at all. The only distinctive feature here is the strategy of locating the origin of our concept of causality and our own experience of acting as free agents, something we, I think, saw and we've seen in the Cartesians, right, maybe the early modern philosophers. They wanted to find out, well, where do we have this concept of causality? Well, maybe it's from our sort of internal experience of undertaking actions that we intend and then finding the results happen. Right? So, and that's what's motivating the agency theory. Basically, they want to find out where do we get this idea of causation. So we'll locate it in our own experience as, intentional agents. Right. So they're locating our concept of causality in our own experience of acting as free agents, and then proposing that we project the concept derived from this experience into the probabilistic conditional relations understood to hold between natural events or possible natural agents, in order to produce a reductive analysis of causation that conceptually distinguishes causation from mere correlation, while avoiding the problem of circularity thought to plague the other Jungian reductionist analysis. What would be of interest for the occasionalist is not just the fact that the occasionalist is committed to relating causality in every case to a free agent, that's God, but also that the occasionalist has reason to address the question about the origin of our concept of causality. We want to know where we get the idea. That we possess such a concept is a requisite for the occasionalist thesis to be intelligible. So otherwise we'd be saying something we don't know what it means, right? We must have some idea of what we mean to say that God is the sole cause of everything. But the thesis itself seems to prohibit our understanding the origin of that idea empirically, on the basis of our experience of the relation between natural events, as the Jungian accounts maintain. Because, we're saying that nothing in nature causes anything else, so how could we get the idea of causation by observing nature, right? Ultimately, those latter accounts do not distinguish causation from mere correlation so much as they identify causation as one or another special kind of spatiotemporal correlation, as distinct from mere correlation. The occasionalist, however, cannot accept an analysis of causation simply as a form of correlation between God's will and independently obtaining events. Events depend necessarily on God's will, in an intrinsic, asymmetrical, directional relationship, not the kind of relationship that the reductionists and the Jungians are talking about. It's an asymmetrical directional relationship, and these events are understood, or at least spoken of, again, as objects of divine intention. The occasionalist understanding of causality is therefore analogous to our own experience of being free, willing agents, executing intended actions, and not on the analogy of any relation we experience between naturally purely physical events involving what we take to be inanimate objects. And yet, for the occasionalist, our common belief that we are agents exercising any causal role in the events is as mistaken as the belief that natural events exercise any such role amongst themselves. We experience ourselves forming intentions to carry out actions, and then we experience actions coming to be roughly as intended, although occasionalists will point out to varying degrees and never with as finely grained and specified intention as the act itself turns out to be. Was that, you intend to do something, you carry it out, but you can't describe in detail the action that just happened. And you can't explain all the details of how it came to be. So that was the argument from before, which was called the stupid argument, right? Okay. You find this in the Kalam as well, right? Somebody says, you intended to walk to the door. You walked to the door. Now count how many steps you took to walk to the door. You don't even know, you're a dummy. So you didn't cause that walking to the door. It's an old argument, right? So the actions themselves, however, again, this is the argument, are brought about by God, who intends them in complete specificity. He knows exactly how many steps you took, and not only that, every other minute description about the walk that you would never know. So he's the one that brought it about. You just rode along, yeah? And you had the experience of intending to do it, and you, right, then rode along. And that's the story, right? So, but still the introspective relation, the introspective experience of the action as an object of our intention does differentiate this relation from mere correlation, right? It helps us to differentiate in concept what a cause is as opposed to a mere correlation. And most definitely, occasionalists want to differentiate between causation and mere correlation. Yeah. It provides, and how does it do that? It provides an intrinsic sense of direction, right? Our experience of being agents, even if it's a false experience, gives us this concept of this direction. I was the agent, I intended it, this is the act. And there's an asymmetric relation between the intention and the act. It goes from one to the other. They're not just, sort of together in an symmetrical relation of correlation. Yeah? There's an intrinsic difference between the two. And so, yeah, this suggests that our concept of causality has its origin in this experience, in spite of the fact that it is not ultimately an experience of our wills exercising real causal agency. If we're occasionalists, we can't say that we cause anything. Yet this proviso poses a problem. For how can the concept of real causality have its origin fully in an experience that is not, in fact, an experience of real causality? We experience the act, to some degree, as an intentional object, but not as an event that is brought about by our intention to act. Right? Because we're committed to it. Our intention is not a cause. This is certainly a strange position to be in as regards our experience of agency, but one in which the advocates of Jungian reductive analyses of causation must also find themselves in, right? Because they say causation is mere correlation. Anyway, we can criticize Jungian, I have more things to say. The occasionalist has the advantage, at least, that this misleading experience more closely resembles how he actually understands causation than it does any of the other analyses on offer. The question is, can this experience, misleading as it can be, also play a leading, revealing role in furnishing us with the concept of causality that further reflection would show ultimately applies only to a single all-powerful divine agency? Can we somehow start with the concept that we get of our causality from our own internal, intentional experience? And, somehow from there, through some kind of self-correction or some kind of further analysis, arrive at a concept which actually is the real concept of causation that applies to God alone, which is what we'd have to agree upon. To the extent that it cannot, the occasionalist would perhaps need to postulate that causality is a primitive, innate concept, just simply unanalyzable, right? Falsely applied to both natural events as well as our own intentional states. In that case, an account of how that false application occurs would be in order. This would presumably come in terms of some special relation between that innate concept and the forms of spatiotemporal correlations or possible correlations that lead us to falsely project it as a relation between natural events so correlated, as well as the nature over intentional states, which lead us to falsely project it as a relation between our intentions and the actions we experience as their objects. That's it. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks. This might be kind of naive on the one hand, but also kind of combative on the other. I don't know. If I understood you correctly, in one sense, I thought the argumentative strategy of this talk was to say, well, if you're an occasionalist, then you ought to accept this theory of causation. And you also spoke of, both in your talk and also in conversation with Doug, of certain causal theories being true or not. So if it's the case, you want to say, if you're an occasionalist, then you should accept this theory of causation. And it turns out that a certain theory of causation is, or that theory of causation turns out to be false. Would you then say, oh, then I therefore must not be an occasionalist?
That's what you'd have to do.
And you'd buy that? Because it seems that you're coming from an occasionalist. That's your, and so I don't know how strong that commitment is and how much that's guiding the argument of the paper. That's kind of the less naive, more combative part.
Person always has to be ready to revise the commitments in the face of evidence that that commitment is incoherent. Yeah. So if we have a account of causation which we use that we think it's compatible with occasionalism and we have independent reason to believe it's true, right? And then we find out that that theory is not true, right? We can always ask ourselves again what causation is and try to understand it in terms it's compatible with occasionalism. If we find that there's no way to do that, right? And if we find demonstrative evidence here that this causation is such and such a thing and that's incompatible with occasionalism, we'll have to review our commitment to occasionalism.
Okay, can I give you another suggestion though? Maybe it's not true, so to speak, to think about these different theories of causation as being true or false, but rather being helpful or unhelpful, or some better or less good way to latch onto the world. So you can always be an occasionalist and have your cake too, or whatever.
Yeah, well, I think it wouldn't work in one sense because an occasionalist is committed to that God causes everything, right? So it's not logically incoherent, but it's a really strange animal there for a person to be an occasionalist and he says, God causes everything. And you say, well, what do you mean by causes everything? He says, well, I mean, whatever it works for me, whenever it seems like we're really, in this case at least, making a pretty strong sort of claim, He creates everything, he makes everything happen. Now, if it's the case, and this is actually a different theory of causation altogether, which this is a kind of a pluralism about causality, so sort of a subjective idea of causality. And that's, I think, what we would have for that's something that's very good for a kind of a theory of quasi-causality for the occasionalist. If a person's not an occasionalist, right, and maybe they're just basically a kind of a Jungian or something, right, then it seems, a kind of a pluralism about causality, where, what causality is, it depends on the context and what you want to do. If you're a scientist doing physics, and causality is one thing. If you're in a legal process and you want to find out who's the one who's at fault for this and should have to pay, then causality means other things. There are different kinds of spatio-temporal relations or non-causal relations, maybe, will be the things that pick out causality in that context, depending on what our needs are, right, for application. And that's fine. And I think for a theory of quasi-causality, that would be also very nice for occasionalists. They could do that easily. But they wouldn't be able to say that, I think, for a theory of causality per se, because that would affect what they mean when they say that God is the cause of everything. And I think that an occasionalist would probably, if he feels worthwhile to be an occasionalist, would want to say that, well, what that means is something pretty fixed. It's not subjective. It's not depending on what I want to get out of it in the context.
It's essentially the same question. I mean, I think to be an occasionalist, one should already have a developed theory of causation or a developed theory of God. Because belief in God, per se, doesn't necessarily lead to causation, doesn't imply occasionalism. So, to believe that God exists or God is the created world, etc., doesn't necessarily entail that God creates all that. How did you put it? God creates all that occurs or all that exists all the time, etc. So, shouldn't one already start with either a developed theory of causation or a developed theory of God to be an occasionalist rather than start with being an occasionalist?
Exactly, you're exactly right. And so I think you have to have reasons to be an occasionalist, I think that if we look at, I'm not sure if the early modern occasionalists were motivated by issues having to do with causation or to what degree they're motivated by theological interests, or issues. I think in the Islamic world, it seems to be it's definitely a theological motivation. I mean, first you have, belief in God, you have a beliefs that are there about God's relation to creation, right? Yeah, and then that comes into conflict with, kind of an Aristotelian paradigm where you have, necessary connections between things based on their intrinsic natures, right? And then you have the problem of miracles and that sort of thing. So we want to be able to say, well, it's possible, for example, that Abraham, it's logically, metaphysically possible, right? That Abraham could have been put in the fire, and the fire remained fire, and Abraham's flesh remained flesh, and at the same time the fire not burn his flesh, right? Whereas, this is the 17th discussion in Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers, right? Where he gives what people think, well, that's the Jungian argument. Well, there's a big difference actually between Ghazali and Jung, but yes, Ghazali does say, well, look at the thing, right? You see the cotton touch the fire, then the cotton burns, but you don't see any necessary connection, right? You just see this existing with that, and existence with does not entail existence by, okay? So he makes the empirical argument that leads to a kind of Jungian philosophy of nature, let's say, or something like that, but not the Jungian analysis of causality as such, yeah? But it's a theological motivation. We have a belief about God, and not only that, actually, I would say it's theological in two ways. There's one motivation that has to do with understanding of God, which is both theological and philosophical. Because if we understand God, for example, as the unmoved mover or necessary existent, if you take a philosophical notion of God from a kind of an Aristotelian or Neoplatonic perspective, right? Strong considerations also lead to occasionalism on that end, right? Just in terms of the metaphysics that you're working with. Yeah? So that's very also resonant with monotheism, and so that's why Muslims really got into those guys. So they also have textual reasons to think that God creates everything and everything is God's will. But there's also a spiritual motivation for occasionalists, in that we actually have a kind of this feeling of we should achieve a certain spiritual state of putting everything into God's hands and everything is God's will. And this, we have a belief in Qadar is one of the principles, or the pillars of Iman for Islamic belief. So making sense of that in the natural world, in terms of that, occasionalism is one option, is one natural way to do that. So there's the motivation there too. And then, so I don't think you're exactly right. It doesn't come from first you have a theory of causation or a problem about causation, and then occasionalism is a certain way to solve or questions about causation. That's not a very good route, I think.
Do you accept that occasionalism isn't the only model within theology, and historically there have been other models?
There are other ones. So I mean, we have the divine concurrence theory, right? The reason we have divine concurrence theory instead of occasionalism is exactly, for example, Aquinas. He wants to, he's committed to that. God is the ground of being, right? Not only does He create everything, but everything depends on Him for continued existence, right? So there's now how can we? That seems like basically spells out occasionalism right there. But Aquinas wants to say, well, things still have their intrinsic natures, and they do things, and God doesn't take away their actions. So it's like occasionalism light, it seems to me, right? We have divine concurrence. So, once we get to that point, we can ask, well, is that really coherent? I mean, are we saying anything else other than just that God makes everything happen? If God's the one that makes everything happen, and He concurs with me, well, what do I add to the whole process? If He wants something to happen but I don't, it's going to go His way, not mine, right? So I don't know what the concurrence really means. I'm just riding along, I guess.
So the bottom line is that occasionalism is the more pious.
No, not at all. It's not that it's more pious. Did you hear what I just said? I'm talking about the philosophical coherence of the two. Now, if, maybe neither of them are coherent, and the whole idea that God has any role in nature is incoherent and everything. So if that turns out to be the case on the analysis of the idea, then we will drop it. But if we have two choices, right, and these are the choices between divine concurrence and occasionalism, you know what I mean? And then it's a matter of which one is more coherent. So I think the strong argument is that occasionalism is more coherent. It's not the argument that it's more pious. I mean, Aquinas might say that concurrence is more pious than occasionalism. There's nothing about being pious.
But to say, take it as a starting point.
I mean, a person might say that an occasionalist is impious because you're saying God made all these bad things happen, and we have to deal with that problem, right? And an occasionalist has to go, well, even the bad things happen as God's will, right? And then, someone comes and says, that's impious. You're blaming God for stuff. Well, we have to work that out, right? It's not just about trying to be more pious. This is a philosophical debate.
I want to make sure if I understand it correctly. You said that probability theory is incompatible with occasionalism, right?
Probability theory.
Yes, sorry, yeah. Is this that necessarily has to be like that? Because if we take it like that, I mean, from man's point of view, if we accept that there is regularity and in the sense that you described that causation, there's a certain regularity, but still we have a limited access to decode whatever kind of regularity is out there. So with respect to past, backwards, yes, we could think that things happened as they had to happen, the way that they had to happen. But with respect to future, things may be different, that we still certain probabilistic account of to try to understand the things. And does this make sense what I'm trying to say? I mean, still, to a certain extent, we should or can think that probabilistic account also can come into the picture.
Probably no problem with the probabilistic account as an account of causation, right? So the occasionalist will be committed to anything probabilistic that's to be said about real causation. It's pretty simple, right? If God wills it, then it's 100% going to happen. If He doesn't, it's 100% it's not going to happen. And there's not going to be much in between there at all. There's nothing in there. So the problem with the probabilistic theory, and in that case, no, it's perfectly compatible, right? The problem here is that say God determines how events happen, right? So we're going to measure the probability of one event given another on the basis of past patterns, of course, yeah? And those past patterns are determined by God. So, it's, of course God can determine events in such a way that it turns out to be that, one natural event is more probable given another natural event than it would be in the absence of that, right? And so we would have a case, right, of what probabilistic theory of causation would call as causality, but we would have to deny that as causality since we're denying that any natural thing is a cause, right? So we can say, yes, there are natural events in the world given which other things are more probable than they would be had that natural event not happened, right? Or if that natural event doesn't happen. But we don't want to say that that events that meet that description are causes, because we're committed to saying that no natural event is a cause. So that probabilistic relation between these events can't be what causation is. Right? But it could be a kind of quasi-causation. It could be something that happens and what we observe in the world and how we think about the world that leads us to think and talk about some things as causes of others, even though they're not. So it's fine as that. And like I said before, when it comes to quasi-causation, I think you're right. I mean, there's no reason why any particular theory would be in principle, wrong unless it was just not useful for the purpose that we have in whatever context that we're in. And let's say natural, yeah. I'm sure there would be some that are wrong. You can come up with some that are ludicrous, right? But there could be a range of things which we take to be, causal and that are different from each other. So any big jokes? Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.